The low hum of the mall's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a constant indifferent background to the bustle of the food court. David Turner, a retired Army veteran, rolled his wheelchair through the entrance, his eyes scanning the food options. He wasn't in the mood for anything fancy, just a quiet meal, something quick before he had to return home and face another lonely evening. His military cap sat low on his brow, covering the small scars from a past he preferred not to remember. Years of service in the field had taken their toll, but David carried the weight with quiet pride. His uniform was no longer the dark camouflage of a soldier, but his Marine Corps cap and the steady, commanding posture in which he sat gave enough of a hint. He still stood tall, just not on 2 feet anymore, but he wasn't here for sympathy. He just wanted to be left alone. David wheeled himself to an empty table, ordered a simple sandwich, and settled in. He was quietly content, sipping on his drink, but as he turned to glance at the bustling food court, a loud burst of laughter echoed in his direction. It came from a group of 3 young men sitting by the window, talking over each other and laughing too loud. From their oversized jackets and cocky attitudes, David could already tell they weren't the type to be bothered by much. As he went back to his sandwich, he tried to ignore the noise. But when he heard his name, mockingly, his stomach clenched. "Hey, look at this guy," one of the teens, Jake, sneered. "Looks like some old vet. I bet he's probably just here for the free food." David's eyes narrowed, his fingers tightening around his drink. The laughter continued. "What's the matter, man? Did you forget to stand up today?" Another teen, Rick, joined in. "Yeah, maybe you can tell us about your brave war stories, if you even remember them." He laughed loudly, mocking an exaggerated slur. David held his breath, the insults feeling too familiar, too close. They didn't know him. They didn't know what he had given, what he had sacrificed. The quiet strength that came from knowing the weight of true service. He wasn't some old man begging for respect, but the mockery struck a nerve, one that had been there since he returned from war, since his injury. As their laughter spilled out around him, David felt something stirring, but he didn't act on it immediately. Discipline. He had been trained to control his emotions. But this wasn't just an insult to him, it was to everything he had sacrificed, to every veteran who had come back with less than they left with. This wasn't just about one man, it was about a generation of people who had given their lives for a cause, and here were these kids making light of it. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, he considered getting up and leaving, walking away, but that would have been just what they wanted, number. They needed to learn, and David would make sure they did. Without another second's hesitation, David pushed his wheelchair towards their table. The young men were so caught up in their own laughter that they didn't even notice him at first. But when David stopped just inches from their table, the noise abruptly died down. Jake, still laughing, looked up at him with a mock expression of surprise. "Oh, look who decided to roll in. What's up, old man? Need some help getting to the bathroom or something?" David didn't flinch. He just looked at him, his eyes piercing. "Is that really how you talk to someone who fought for your right to act like an ass?" David asked, his voice low and calm, but carrying a weight that no one expected. Tyler, the ringleader, gave a cocky smirk and leaned back in his chair. "Oh, I didn't know we were talking to a war hero," he mocked. "What? You a vet or something?" David's eyes never wavered from Tyler's face. No anger, no defensiveness, just absolute control. "You really want to keep talking like that?" Tyler, seeing the lack of reaction, tried to play it off. "What? You're just gonna sit there and stare at me? What are you, some kind of..." Before he could finish his sentence, David reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small military ID and holding it up for Tyler to see. The embossing was still visible, the faint gold insignia of the Marine Corps gleaming under the light. Tyler's smirk faltered. The others at the table fell silent. "Yeah, I'm a vet," David said, his voice still steady. "And I earned my service. Not for you to make jokes, not for you to mock me, but for freedom, for your right to be here, making fun of people who are better than you." Jake, still not fully believing what was happening, stood up. "Hey man, calm down. You're just some old..." David's voice cut through the air, so calm it almost felt like a command. "You think it's funny to disrespect someone who served, kid?" The group of teenagers grew visibly uncomfortable, their cocky bravado slowly starting to wither away as they realized who they were dealing with. Jake took a step back, his arrogance replaced by doubt. David didn't need to say another word. He simply looked at them, his gaze unwavering, and that was when the quiet tension hit. The sound of the food court around them seemed to fade as David stood tall in his chair, commanding the respect he had long since earned. "You don't owe me an apology, but you owe respect to all those who fought and bled for this country, and you'll learn it whether you like it or not." Tyler's cocky expression was completely gone, replaced with something else, a little bit of fear and a lot of embarrassment. The group stood still for a few seconds. None of them knew what to say. David took a step back, gave one last piercing look to the group, and turned on his heel, rolling back towards his seat. But before he could sit down, he heard a faint voice behind him. Tyler, but now with a tremor in his voice. "Sorry." David didn't respond. He just sat down, finishing his meal as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. He had reminded these kids that there was more to respect than their own egos. The sound of his wheelchair rolling across the tile floor was the only thing breaking the eerie silence. David settled back at his table, taking a moment to adjust his posture, his calm demeanor unshaken. He was used to the stares, the whispers, but today, something felt different. The air had changed. Even the overhead lights seemed to hum a little less. The group of teenagers, now unnervingly quiet, were still standing near their table, unsure of what to do. Tyler had sat back down, his shoulders slumped forward, his eyes downcast. The others sat still, unable to meet David's gaze. For a moment, everything felt like it was frozen in time, suspended in that tangible tension that only a room full of strangers could share. The mockery had been replaced by something more humbling, the realization that they had been exposed. David took another bite of his sandwich, the taste of the turkey and cheese a comfort, a small bit of normality in the midst of everything. He didn't need to say much more. His words, carefully chosen, had already made their mark. The lesson had been delivered, and now it was up to them to reflect on it. Minutes passed, and the atmosphere in the food court began to shift. The teens who had once been full of arrogance now sat with their heads down, almost avoiding eye contact with anyone. Their food sat half-eaten, untouched as they fidgeted nervously in their seats. David, without looking up, could feel it, the change. They weren't laughing anymore. The usual chatter had quieted. There was no more mocking or loud insults. It was almost as though they realized, too late, just how out of their depth they were. But this wasn't about humiliation. David wasn't interested in their apologies. This was about earning respect, something they would now have to come to terms with, whether they liked it or not. The way they acted in that moment, the immaturity and the arrogance, was a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. David finished his sandwich slowly, savoring each bite, enjoying the quiet of the moment. For the first time, he felt no need to rush, no reason to get back to the chaos of the world outside. The world had stopped, and it was perfectly fine to just be. About 20 minutes later, as David was wiping his mouth with a napkin, Tyler stood up from the table. His friends, still sitting with their heads down, avoided looking at him. The cocky kid from earlier, the one who had been so full of bravado, was now stepping toward David. "Hey, sir?" Tyler's voice was shaky, uncertain. David looked up slowly, his expression still calm, but there was something in his eyes now. Patience. Tyler's eyes flickered nervously to the side, as if he couldn't quite look at the man he had mocked just moments ago. "I just wanted to say," Tyler stammered, clearly uncomfortable with this sudden shift in the situation, "that I'm sorry for everything. You're right." He paused, as if trying to find the right words. David didn't say anything at first. He simply nodded. The apology wasn't important. What mattered was that Tyler had recognized the truth. The words were hard to come by for the young man, but in the end, the sincerity of his apology was all that David needed. Tyler, standing there in front of a man he had once mocked, was showing humility, a trait he would carry with him for the rest of his life. David took a long breath, then smiled. "It takes a man to admit he was wrong. You did that." Tyler blinked, surprised by the reaction, but he stood there for a moment longer, not knowing exactly how to respond. Finally, he turned and walked back to his friends, who were all staring at him now. They were silent. They didn't laugh. They didn't say anything. The group simply nodded at Tyler, as if silently acknowledging the shift in their attitudes. They knew, too, that they'd learned something tonight. As David prepared to leave, he didn't linger. He paid for his meal, tipped the waitress generously, and began to roll toward the exit. As he passed the table with the teenagers, he gave them one last glance. Tyler and his friends were still sitting there, but now they weren't the same group that had mocked him just hours before. They were quiet, reflective, even a little ashamed. David stopped for a moment, looked directly at Tyler, and said simply, "Take care, kid. And remember what I said." The words weren't meant to be a lecture anymore. They were just a reminder of the lesson Tyler and his friends would carry with them for the rest of their lives. As he exited the diner, the sound of the door chime ringing behind him seemed to echo louder than usual. There was no need for words now. The lesson had been learned, and David knew it was a lesson that would stay with these young men long after they left the food court. The silence that followed their encounter was not one of defeat, but of reflection. And in that reflection, David had taught them something far more important than how to respect a veteran. He had taught them what it meant to be a man,